Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric series, The Port Authority, where I took a look at some of my favorite arcade games of all time and weigh them against their home console counterparts. And obviously, if you can't tell already, we're playing Virtua Fighter 2 today on the Sega Model 2 as well as the Sega Saturn. And while the Sega Saturn port is an incredible time, it does have differences, obviously, to the much more powerful Sega Model 2. So we're going to be going over both versions of the game, talking about the similarities and the differences, and at the end, rendering a verdict which version you should play. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, you got a Patreon link down below as well. By starting off with the Model 2 footage, this is just absolutely an iconic look, and I'm not going to be doing any side-by-sides on this one today because I want you to get a better look at the backgrounds and the overall motion in the footage. On the Model 2 version of the game, everything other than those trees you're seeing in the background is made out of polygons. This is why Model 2 was such an impressive piece of hardware for its time. It was more powerful than anything else at home or on arcade floors, and it really could push around a ton of polygons while maintaining a 60 frame per second frame rate. That is how good Sega was with their hardware partners at developing hardware that would just basically blow your minds when you got to arcades. And obviously the Sega Saturn not being the most powerful machine of all time and having some odd hardware, a port was definitely going to be something that was difficult for Sega. And as we move over to the Sega Saturn side of things, the best part here is that the game in and of itself was ported over so well. This is the full fat Virtua Fighter 2 experience that you know, love, and remember from the arcades. It just has some fundamental differences. First off, everything in the background that isn't the playfield or the characters is going to be 2D sprites now. It does a very good job of tricking you into thinking that it actually is going to be 3D, but it is just a little bit of a perspective trick. And that's totally fine, these things do happen. Obviously the Sega Saturn couldn't push as many polygons as something like the Model 2, so they have to go in and basically take some of those polygons out and reduce down the amount of polys on screen at once to get that frame rate up. So that is what you're seeing here. And moving back over to the Model 2 footage, this stage is very interesting because we have that fully polygonal pavilion in the background, but you're going to notice the lighting effects of the lightning and how they strike the models and basically light them up, as well as the playfield. Pay close attention to that because it is on Sega Saturn, but it has a completely different look. I mean, obviously Virtua Fighter 2 is one of the most iconic fighting games of all time. The original Virtua Fighter was great, but I would say this is where the series really picked up steam and got good, for lack of a better term. So let's move over to the Sega Saturn footage here and look at the exact same thing. You're going to see the lightning coming out. You're going to see all of it hitting the playfield, but it doesn't have as much intensity, and it doesn't really light up the character models in the same way. And then again, that pavilion in the background is going to be removed from the polygon realm and put right back into the 2D asset area. And that's always interesting. It does do a very effective job of making it look like it is full 3D and letting the game run at that full frame rate, but it isn't the same, and you can totally tell. As we move back over to the model footage here, you're going to see again just an uptick in the overall image quality, the amount of polygons on screen, the overall effects that the engine can render, and everything else. And if you think that one image is clearer or more fluid than the other, do leave me a comment down below because I would be curious. Obviously, the Sega Saturn version runs in an interlaced mode, and that's been captured here with the RetroTink 4K and MiSTer FPGA, but we'll get into that just a little bit more in the future. Now, the stage that has the most fundamental difference, in my opinion, is Shun Stage, where you're floating down the river going underneath those bridges. You see the real-time lighting there, or the baked-in shadows. You see the bridge you're going underneath. This is such a dynamic, interesting stage because it really is moving the entire time. Now, unfortunately, on the Sega Saturn side of things, this was just too much. That bridge has been completely removed, and you're basically taking place in a fight on land here. It doesn't have the same effect, and while it is still the same fun gameplay, this is definitely an area in which the Sega Saturn just couldn't keep up in any way, shape, or form with the Model 2. But it never was really expected to. The Model 2 was an insanely powerful piece of hardware for its time, having involvement with Lockheed Martin in its development, where the Sega Saturn obviously had to be a consumer price product for the home, so you were never going to get Model 2 performance. So this is actually outstanding for what it does. But here comes your sound sample, first Model 2, then Sega Saturn. Listen, and I'll be right back with a lot more.
Ready, go! KO!
my opinion, the clear winner there is the Sega Model 2. The sound is just clear. On the Sega Saturn, I always felt like the sounds are a little bit muffled, especially when the announcer says KO. You can hear that was just definitely sampled down a little bit. I don't know why they would have done that, because they had the capability of storing it all on CD, but it could be something about storing it in RAM and having to reduce down the quality just to make sure it does fit. But as we move into the next stage here, now on the Sega Saturn footage, again, I can't commend the Sega Saturn port enough. It never had the ability to live up to the Model 2 original, but that's because this hardware is definitely much more inferior, and that is not a strike on the hardware. It's just to say, back in this generation, arcade hardware was so much better than you had at home. Unfortunately, these days you basically just have mid-range PCs and boxes when you go to play an arcade game, but in the 90s, this is what you saw in arcades, and you absolutely couldn't believe this was the level of 3D somebody like Sega was capable of actually drawing. And as we move again, obviously, to the Model 2 footage, I do think that some stages benefit from having the polygons in the background. On the Sega Saturn side of things, some stages look exactly like their arcade counterparts, but here with the pagoda in the background and all of those stairs and the wall underneath the dragon, they just have a better sense of scale and depth than they are in proper 3D. Along with that burning cauldron and the building in the back, it just has a little bit more going on visually. Now moving over to the Sega Saturn to the next stage, here's an area in which that 2D I think actually works relatively well in the background. Sure, there's a little bit of scaling weirdness as it moves around to try to basically fake perspective, but I do think it looks relatively good. Now if you have noticed any sort of difference in the footage, it should be obvious. The Sega Saturn version of this game runs in high resolution mode on the Saturn at 480i, so it has to be captured as interlaced and then deinterlaced, where on the Sega Model 2 it is running in progressive frames. And you will see here that the 3D looks slightly better on that wall, and it gives you more of a sense of the actual perspective, but I would say that both versions basically match each other as far as trying to actually articulate the visuals and concept on display. You know where you are, you know where the fight is taking place, so there really isn't any problem on the Saturn side of things. Now as far as the difficulty is concerned, arcade normal versus Sega Saturn normal, I do think the game was adjusted for Sega Saturn, because obviously they weren't trying to get you to pump quarters in. I always find the arcade version of Virtua Fighter 2 ever so slightly harder. But moving back to the first stage and switching it up with Shun here, I do love how all of the fabric moves in the Model 2 version. You have a slight bit more animation as far as the characters are concerned, at least in some of the objects. It feels like they're maybe rendered at a higher frame rate. It's possible that there was something reduced down in the Sega Saturn animations, but you watch really closely and you tell me what you think once we move to the Sega Saturn side, and pay attention to Lau's ponytail as well. That's one of those items in the game that has a real sense of physics to it, and that was something we really weren't used to back in the day. In the 90s, things really didn't move whatsoever. They were just kind of stationary. Now moving over here to the Sega Saturn version of the game, you might notice that Lau's ponytail just seems to move a little bit more jerky, like they reduced down the keyframes in the animation just to make sure that it did move and still have that arcade look. And it's really effective on the Sega Saturn, but if you watch it side by side with the Model 2 footage I just showed you, you can notice those differences. But I think the main takeaway here is that the Sega Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 2 was an absolute hit. It was a 10 out of 10 of getting an arcade game that everyone knew onto a home console that had a completely different and less powerful hardware, and still making sure all the fun and the gameplay was intact. And for the most part on port authority, the arcade version always wins because it had more powerful hardware, and that is the instance here as far as Virtua Fighter 2 is concerned. You know I love the Sega Saturn, you know I love playing Sega Saturn games, but in a perfect world when it's easy to play both of these games either via software emulation, original hardware, although that would be hard on the model side of things, or even MiSTer FPGA with Sega Saturn, I would say play the arcade version of Virtua Fighter 2 on Model 2 emulator. It is the full fat game from the arcade. You get better graphics, more polygons, more effects here like you see in the lightning stage for Sarah. It is just the ultimate version of the game as far as Virtua Fighter 2 is concerned. But leave me a comment down below and tell me, where's the first time you played Virtua Fighter 2? Was it on the Sega Saturn or was it in arcades? For me, I played it in arcades first and Sega Saturn second, and I love both versions of the game. But as far as port authority is concerned, rendering that final verdict, if you want to play the best version of Virtua Fighter 2, play the arcade version on Model 2. Bye bye.